Alex O'Connor and Dan McClellan just had one of the best conversations on the gods of the Bible that I have recently heard. But they left out a crucial detail. The term Elohim was discussed, but never fully defined. It was just accepted as what we in modern times view as a god. But is this how the biblical writers and original audience understood the term Elohim? Well, if we're basing this off of the biblical text, then the answer is no. And that's why this video was created. And I will also briefly cover monotheism as well as Deuteronomy 32, specifically regarding the separate deities. And just to be clear, this is not an attack on Alex or Dan. While I do disagree with some of their conclusions, I love these guys, and I watch a lot of their content. But let's talk about Elohim. Now, as you can see, I've got here pulled up on the screen every single occurrence of the term Elohim within the biblical text, roughly 2,600 times. And then on the bottom is the sense in which Elohim occurs. So you can see the vast majority of the time, it is referring to the Israelite God or Yahweh. And so obviously I'm not going to go through every single one of those verses, but this is to demonstrate that one of the ways that Elohim is defined is Yahweh. Now the second way that Elohim is defined is the Angel of Yahweh. And we read in Genesis 35 verse 7, and there he, being Jacob, built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God, Elohim, had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And within all of these slides, if you see the term God in gold and underlined, that is an indication that the Hebrew term Elohim is being used. But you might be asking, how is this referring to the angel? Well, we do have to do some backtracking here. If we go to Genesis 31, verses 11 through 13, we read this. Then the angel of God, Elohim, said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. Moving on a little bit, and he said, lift your eyes up and see. And I cut some text out in verse 12 to get to this point. I am the God of Bethel. Now that's not the term Elohim there, that is the term El. But if we go back to Genesis 28 verse 13, it says this, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, this is the Jacob's ladder scene, which is best understood in terms of an ancient ziggurat. I am the Lord, the God Elohim of Abraham your father, and the God Elohim of Isaac. And now moving down to verse 17, this is Jacob speaking. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of Elohim, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. So we can see two different things from these texts here. One is that it appears that Yahweh and the angel of Yahweh are seen as one and the same, which Dan and Alex hit a little bit on in their conversation. But it also indicates that Elohim is a term that is used to describe the angel of Yahweh. Now, another instance of Elohim that is used is in terms of members of Yahweh's divine council. We can see Psalm 82 verse 6. They covered this a little bit in their video. And it says this, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. So this is a reference to the sons of God, or members of the divine council, being referred to as Elohim. There's also Psalm 8 verses 4 and 5 that state, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and that is the term Elohim. So you have made him a little lower than the Elohim. We see here again, this is members of the divine council. There's also gods and goddesses of the other nations. In 1 Kings 11:33, we read, because they, it's talking about the Israelites here, because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the Ammonites, and they have not walked in my ways. In each of these three instances, goddess, god, and god, it is the term Elohim. So this is a reference to the gods and goddesses of other nations. There's also the term demons, and this did come up in Alex and Dan's discussion as well. And yes, the term for demons, shadim, in this passage is up for debate as to what it actually means. Nonetheless, we're going to include it in the list because they did as well. But Deuteronomy 32:17 says, they sacrificed to the demons, not God, to gods, Elohim, whom they had not known, new gods who came from recent times. Their ancestors had not known them. Now again, I just want to be clear here because God occurs 3 times in this passage. The only time that it is Elohim is this second instance that I have highlighted and underlined in gold. But perhaps the most interesting occurrence of the term Elohim is a reference to a deceased human being. In 1 Samuel 28:13 through 14, this is the scene where Saul goes to the medium at Endor to call up the prophet Samuel. And this is what it states. And the woman, the medium, said to Saul, I see a God, Elohim, coming up out of the earth. He said to her, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. So here we have the deceased prophet Samuel described as an Elohim. And so this begs the question, with all 6 of these beings described as Elohim, what does the term actually mean? How can we define it? And I believe, as has rightly been pointed out by some, Elohim can best be described as a being that resides within the spiritual realm, or a resident of the spiritual realm. And therefore we can state that yes, there are many Elohim, and Yahweh is the supreme Elohim. There is none like him. And this list of different beings described as Elohim that I went through were done according to rank, or at least somewhat in the fashion of rank, with Yahweh being up at the top, down to the deceased human being Samuel at the bottom. But this is how you can get some passages saying things like, Yahweh is the God of gods. Who among the gods is like you? And then in other passages you have, there is no other God but Yahweh. There's no other Elohim but Yahweh. So what's going on there? Dan touched on that in the video. It's a term of comparison. It would be like Tom Brady today saying, I am the quarterback and there is no other. He's not saying that Peyton Manning and Eli Manning, who would be like, hey, didn't I beat you in a Super Bowl? He would not be saying those individuals do not exist. What he's saying is that he is far superior to all of those quarterbacks. That'd be a cocky statement. He didn't say that, but just as an example. But this does bring us to monotheism. And as Dan has rightfully pointed out in other videos, monotheism is a modern term, and it denotes a single deity, and that all other deities are non-existent. They are false gods created in the minds of humans. That's at least how it's defined in current times. I know Dan did a deeper dive on the history of the word, and he might have a little bit different opinion on what it actually means within the context of who first brought it into existence. But at least in Christianity today, broadly speaking, monotheism is there is one God, every other God is false, not real. And Gavin Ortland, whom they mentioned, and I also like, tries to defend this view, and I respectfully on this think that he is incorrect and that Dan has the stronger position. However, I still think that monotheism can be used, but as I stated earlier, some tweaking needs to be done, and a distinction needs to be made between quote-unquote modern monotheism and quote biblical monotheism. And I only use that term biblical monotheism, not to cheat, but because I've heard other people describe it this way, because there's really not a better term out there for it. And biblical monotheism is not that other Elohim are non-existent, but that Yahweh is the supreme Elohim, the author, the creator, and the sustainer of all, including the other Elohim. These other Elohim were created by him and are under his rule. And this brings us to Deuteronomy 32, which is why it was Yahweh that allotted the nations away in Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. And I know that might raise some red flags because Dan did comment that perhaps these verses show a distinction between Yahweh and Elyon, the Most High. However, I want to examine this a little bit more, first by looking at these verses. And here's what they state. When the Most High, Elyon, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples, according to the number of the sons of God. And by the way, to Alex's point in the video, I actually prefer this translation, sons of God. I think Dan did a fabulous job in laying out that this is in fact the correct translation. Moving on to verse 9. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. So if we look specifically here at verse 9 is actually made up of verbless clauses. So the Most High is not giving anything away, and Yahweh is not receiving anything in verse 9. And we can look at a passage that is linked to this Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9 narrative, and that's going back to Deuteronomy 4, 19 through 20. I know what some of you are thinking. I'm going to address it. And here's what it says. This is being spoken to the Israelites. And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them. Things that Yahweh, your Elohim, has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. And so here in verse 19, it is Yahweh who allotted, who halaked the host of heaven for all people under the whole heaven to serve. And in verse 20 it says, but Yahweh has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are to this day. So in verse 20, it is Yahweh who took, another verb, this time lakah, his people out of Egypt to be his own inheritance. And so what this is saying is that Yahweh does the deciding on who gets what. It is Yahweh that did the allotting and the taking of his choice of people. And I know at this point, at least some people are going to say, hold on a second, Deuteronomy 4 is actually later than Deuteronomy 32. And again, this is something that Alex brought up, I think brilliantly in their discussion, that the biblical text is pieced together and that the text is not aligned chronologically to how everything was written. And if Dan does in fact write a book on that and do the research behind that, that is something I am really looking forward to. But again, and I would agree with this based on what I've seen, is that Deuteronomy 4 is later than Deuteronomy 32. And many are going to say that this is the author or the redactor trying to smooth things out, trying to essentially not have this two distinct deities in Deuteronomy 32 problem. I will say there are a couple individuals who have commented on the difficulty of dating such passages, but hey, let's just go with it for now. Again, like I said, I'm in agreement. I don't think this is necessarily a big deal because these events draw on Genesis 11, specifically the Tower of Babel. And this is the event where the Most High, to quote Deuteronomy 32:8, gave to the nations their inheritance, divided mankind, and fixed the borders according to the number of the sons of God. And like I said earlier, Alex, I prefer the sons of God because as Dan says, it's been confirmed to be the correct translation. But Genesis 32:8 and 9 is referring to the Babel story. And Genesis 11, 1 through 9, which is where the Tower of Babel story occurs, is attested to the J source, if we're going by the critical dating, which I'm completely fine with. And this dates to the 10th to 9th centuries BCE. I have seen some people say the 8th century BCE, but the majority of what I've seen is 10th to 9th century BCE. This would mean this event dates before Deuteronomy 32. And in Genesis 11, there is a council scene. We have another one of those, let us go down, let us do this instances. So in verse 7, it says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. Then the very next verse, verse 8, says, so Yahweh dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth. And they left off building the city. So this is another one of those instances where there is a let us do something, the we aspect of things, but then it is Yahweh alone who carries out the deed. And so here in Genesis chapter 11, we have the description that it was Yahweh who did the dividing that was referred to in Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9, where it stated when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance. And again, Genesis 11 being attributed to the J source in the 10th to 9th centuries BCE. And for the record, I have seen some individuals come out and say they think that the Tower of Babel story is post-exilic, within that 5th century BCE timeframe. However, the majority of what I have seen, and that has been within recent scholarship, is that it is still 10th to 9th centuries BCE, somewhere within that range. And furthermore, we have Hebrew poetry, which, as Dan pointed out, represents the older material within the biblical text. And Psalm 29 is no exception to this. And there are some scholars that have dated this psalm to the 12th to 10th centuries BCE. I know others have not, but there are some that have. And this is what it says. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Yahweh sits enthroned as king forever. And there's also passages from the pre-exilic Deuteronomistic material, such as 2 Samuel 22:32, which states, for who is God but Yahweh? For who is El but Yahweh? And in addition to this, Mark Smith, who is an Old Testament scholar who specializes in Israelite religion as well as late Bronze Age Ugarit, has made the observation that Yahweh and El were merged by the 8th century BCE, which means that this fusion had occurred before Deuteronomy was composed, which would beg the question as to what the author of Deuteronomy or the redactor would have in mind to bring that Yahweh-El separation back that had been rejected some 200 years prior to this. There's also verses 6 and 7 to consider, which appear to contain numerous El epithets that are attributed to Yahweh. So you would have to explain why the redactor of verses 6 and 7 would unite Yahweh and El, and then in the following verses 8 and 9, separate them. This would be a horrific blunder on the part of a redactor. And you would also have to contend with Mark Smith's notion that, again, the fusion happened 200 years prior to this. And just to be clear, when I use terms like unite, merge, and fuse, I'm not talking about two deities just getting mashed together. What I'm talking about is the traits of El that were attributed to Yahweh. An example of this would be where the Ugaritic texts call El the Father of Years, and then in the biblical text, Yahweh is called the Ancient of Days. In other words, it's, oh, you're saying that El is the Father of Years, but it's actually Yahweh that is that. You see this with Baal epithets as well, such as the rider on the clouds. It's not Baal that rides on the clouds, it's Yahweh that rides on the clouds. It's he who is in control in the mind of the biblical writers. It is a polemic against these gods to demonstrate the superiority of Yahweh, that he is the Most High. and the one true God. But if you want the full breakdown of Deuteronomy 32, check out this video where I responded to Dan in depth on God having a dad. Or if you prefer a video on me engaging with Alex's Genesis 1:1 mistranslation, you can click here. And I hope this video was helpful. If it was, do me a favor and like and subscribe, and be sure to check out my other videos and playlist on biblical mythology. Thank you all so much, and I will see you in the next video.